Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first informational and welcoming webinar. We're very excited to be with all of you today. We will be discussing an initiative related to PKD, and specifically the PKD Research Consortium. And our goal today is to kind of go discuss with you all what we would like to achieve and do with your support. I would like to introduce myself. I am Reem Mustafa. I'm one of the kidney doctors at the University of Kansas Medical Center. I'm a professor of medicine, and I do direct the outcome and implementation research. And it is really my pleasure and honor to be with all of you today. Lisa?
Yeah, thank you, Reem. And I'm Lisa Guay-Woodford. I am a professor of pediatrics at Children's National Hospital and the George Washington University, where I direct our Center for Translational Research. I have the pleasure of partnering with Reem in the PKD Research Resource Consortium to develop a patient engagement component, and that is a bi-directional dialogue between the research community and the patient community, so that we can truly understand what's on your minds and what are the most pressing issues, so that we can further research to addressing those issues and advancing our understanding of PKD and optimal therapies. So I'm going to turn the forum back over to Reem for the first part of this presentation.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we would like to discuss the mission and goals of this initiative, really talk about PKD and specifically ADPKD. We're going to discuss what is the PKD Research Resource Consortium. Then we'll talk about some patient engagement efforts that we have been involved with. And then we'll talk about, in general, patient engagement and a proposed plan for this effort. We'll discuss our timeline and next steps. So let's start. So starting with our mission and goals, we actually want to establish an equitable partnership with patients who have cystic kidney disease. We would like to obtain patients' perspective on cystic kidney disease and address pressing issues to help advance treatment development. And we also want to set patient-driven agenda for cystic kidney disease, clinical care, and hopefully eventually research priorities as well. With that all in mind, it is kind of important. I know many of you already know what PKD is and what ADPKD is, but we just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So what is PKD? Polycystic kidney disease is a set of single gene disorders that causes chronic kidney disease and progressive worsening of kidney function. There are two types: dominant ADPKD or a recessive form, which is ARPKD. Abnormal genes do cause polycystic kidney disease, which means that in most cases, the disease runs in families. The development of cysts in the kidneys causes them to enlarge and lose function over time. So with all that in mind, now we're going to switch gears because this initiative is actually specifically about ADPKD, so the dominant form. And for ADPKD, it is different than other kidney diseases where the cause is by inherited genetic mutation or mutations. And the two main causative genes are PKD1 and PKD2. It affects younger ages. And by age 60, half of the patients with ADPKD may develop end-stage kidney disease. And then ADPKD has a considerable variability in terms of disease progression and severity, even within the same family. So with that in mind, now we want to kind of talk more about what is this Research Resource Consortium, and kind of to build our understanding of what this is, it would be appropriate to start by thinking about what is a consortium. A consortium is a group made up of 2 or more individuals or companies or groups that actually work together to achieving a common objective or goal. So it's really a collaboration between a group or individuals that want to work toward a certain goal. Now, what's a research consortium? A research consortium is essentially that group made up of 2 or more researchers or research groups that work together to achieving a common objective related to research. So it's a collaboration, but that's specifically in relation to research. How about a research resource consortium? Here, we're talking about a group made up of 2 or more research groups that work together to develop and make available research resources that help move the field forward and move our understanding of a disease process and progression forward. And in this case, an example, the disease we're interested here in is PKD. So talking more specifically about the PKD Research Resource Consortium, this is an initiative that is funded by the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive and Kidney Disease, NIDDK, one of the institutes from NIH. We develop and share investigative resources, reagents, and expertise with the broader research community to accelerate innovation in discovery in the field of polycystic kidney disease. So we're not doing research studies ourselves, rather we're making these resources available for others. This initiative supports a collaborative, diverse community of investigators who are working to advance discovery in the area of polycystic kidney disease. And we really pride ourselves by the true collaboration and diversity among the group. The PKD RRC has currently 4 committees. The first committee is the committee about in vivo PKD models and reagents, which essentially coordinates experimental and animals and tissues and make them available for researchers. The second committee is cell models, which deals with cells derived from human patients and from animal models. The third committee is antibodies and vectors, which this committee actually makes reagents available, which these reagents to make and evaluate proteins and help advance that field of research. And then there is a clinical resource and biomaterial committee, which actually manages the patient-derived blood, urine, DNA, and tissue. So as you see, pretty broad and a lot of focus on basic science within this research resource consortium. Now that we talked about what is the PKD RRC, we want to go over some of the patient engagement and what we have done to date. Now, when we think about patient engagement, it's really important to us to make the distinction between patient involvement in research, which typically, like you see in the upper part of this slide, that there is a research team and they really recruit patients to participate in clinical studies. That's patient involvement. What we're interested in here is a true partnership, true engagement between the research team and patients to think together, discuss together, explore together, and think about what are these resources and make these resources available that will help advance the research and advance clinical studies. So it's different than the involvement. We're really truly interested in true partnership. And like Lisa described earlier, this bi-directional relationship, bi-directional discussion. We're not interested to tell anyone what to do. We're very interested to hear about, from the patient's perspective, what they think is important. Okay. Why is patient engagement important? It's this is like stating the obvious, but we want to highlight it is important. It's an important component of patient and family-centered care. We want to create an environment where patients, families, clinicians, hospital staff, researchers, we all work together as partners to improve the quality and safety of care, and involves patients and family member as both members of the healthcare and research team, but also as advisors working with clinicians and researchers and leaders, I apologize, to improve policies and procedures. So what have we done to date? We have actually met with leads from other patient engagement effort and spoke with many of them about the successes, what could have been done differently in their efforts that they have been involved with. We also looked at all the NIH consortia out there that had a patient engagement effort, an element to it. We wanted to summarize best practices in patient engagement from the literature. So we did pretty comprehensive literature review about any patient engagement effort, whether it's in chronic kidney disease or polycystic kidney disease. And based on all that, we established and refined what we consider the conceptual framework. But again, the reason why we truly believe our situation is quite unique. A lot of these efforts in the past are actually focused on patient engagement in research. So there are many other research consortium out there that actually have patient engagement effort. The issue that we're dealing with and the uniqueness that we're dealing with is we're not a research consortium, we're a research resource consortium. We're making resources available. And how could we effectively enter a dialogue with patients and partnership to make sure that it's a true informative to everybody, to all involved partnership, and actually an effective one. The other thing is, in addition to all that, both Lisa and myself actually have worked on patient engagement effort extensively in the past. And I'm going to describe to you one of the efforts we have been involved with. Some of you have been involved with as well. So an initiative that we're very proud of is our experience with what we call Empower PKD. Empower PKD is short for establishing meaningful patient-centered outcome with relevant to patients with polycystic kidney disease. Actually, Empower PKD, there is a website and you can look at empowerpkd.org at what we have done. But in summary, we have engaged in multiple focus groups, specifically for patients. We had 8 groups with 90 patients and caregiver. We also talked with the researcher and clinical expert in one of these focus groups. And at the end, we had lots of discussion, both open-ended discussion, and we used very specific techniques. We call it a nominal voting technique, where patients were part of moving the agenda forward for what is important from a patient perspective to be included in studies. And as you see on this slide, it was a very interactive session where people will go up to the board and prioritize what they think, agree or disagree with. And it was a really, truly wonderful effort, because we also were quite successful in recruiting a diverse group from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And we think that is really important. And as we were talking with our patients in Empower PKD, we focused on 4 different areas. One of them about the impact of the disease, one of them about the outcomes that they care about to be addressed in studies. We also talked about what helps them be engaged and activated as patient partners. And we talk about insurability issues, which very interesting. We were kind of what one of the earlier groups address, because that's an issue that is more pertinent to the United States. But I'm not going to have time to talk more about Empower PKD. But before I hand to Lisa, I want to leave you with the next slide, where when we ask patients about what is the impact of PKD in your life, and we put all of it into a Wordle, and you see family is in the center of this. We're talking about life and children and sometimes fear, but research is up there, the future. So to us, we cannot do this without you. We need your input in everything we do, and we value it so much. And hopefully, by working together, that we're going to have, improve and have an even more positive experience for the patient experience moving forward. But we want your input with our PKD RRC and your help. And with that, I would like to hand to Lisa, who's going to talk about her experience, and then some more about what are we planning to do next.
Yeah, thank you, Reem. So, I love Wordles because I think it gives weighting in a very visual way to what's important. And I would just call your attention to this corner of the slide. Research is right next to hopeful, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. We want you to be part of the hope. And to do that, we need to understand what is most concerning to you. So as I mentioned, I'm a pediatric nephrologist. My interest is both children with AD PKD, but also children with the recessive form of polycystic kidney disease. And I have a wonderful collaboration with Professor Charlotte Gimpel at the University of Freiburg in Germany, where we're capturing quality of life and priorities for clinical research from primarily parents, but also patients with autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease. And because this is a transatlantic collaboration, we can't all get in a room together. Also, COVID sort of changed that to a great extent. And what we're using is a platform called Miro that allows us to sort of do the sticky notes that Reem did in her real world room, to do that on an electronic platform. And what this basically involves is the sticky notes have priorities on them that individual parents or patients in an individual discussion session, write out in terms of their priorities. And then we ask them to rank order them for improving. This is very, very important to me to, I could tolerate these and it would be okay. And we ask parents to prioritize this, and then we actually can capture their priorities so each of them are captured. And it allows us to do what we call a cross-sectional study. In other words, taking numbers of individual engagements to assess quality of life issues for patients with ARPKD, their parents, and to document the burden of disease in the children, but also the burden of disease in the caregivers. Again, a hugely important issue in pediatrics. The specific ask here is not just what's important to you, but if I were a fairy god person and had a fairy god person wand, what would be your top priority for a clinical trial? What's the thing that you would like to see addressed? And so then the idea is that we're going to put together perspectives primarily from Germany, but also other centers in Europe. We're going to use our site in the United States to get a US perspective, and take these results forward, whether it be to NIH-funded studies or pharmaceutical company-funded studies, and incorporate these perspectives into the planning of future clinical trials, giving patients and their parents an important voice in the process. And let me give you an example. So we are actively recruiting for a brand new clinical trial in the recessive form of polycystic kidney disease. It requires a baseline visit, a screening visit, and then monthly visits for 6 months. Now, we have two groups of patients, one between 1 month and 3 months of age, and the second from 1 month all the way up to 18 years of age. And I was talking with a family who was very interested in participating in this study. They have a 4-month-old child with the recessive form of polycystic kidney disease. And when I explained the study, they were very interested. And then I explained some of the logistics of the study. And the parents said to me, wait, you can only support travel from our home in the deep South to Washington with one parent? That's just not going to work. We can't do that. And it was the first time that a logistical issue, a logistical barrier really came to our attention, because these parents are caring for a child who has a lot of normal baby needs, but also a lot of medical needs. And to travel to do this study, they need to have this be, a 2-on-1, 2 parents for this one child. And so we had to bring this back to the pharmaceutical company and say, we got to rethink this for these really young children. That was very important. It is an example of how patient and family participation can change a study so that it is more practical, more feasible, and actually can get the kinds of information that we're looking to get from the study. So thinking about how you could take that example and translate it into the patient engagement group that we're proposing, we have a series of timelines. So tonight's the informational webinar. This will be followed by a discussion webinar that I'll describe in just a moment. But we have talked about sort of capturing people's interest, and we've decided to do that with what we're calling the PKD RRC survey, or put it another way, a sort of very brief resume. Who you are, and that includes how old you are, what part of the country you live in, what's your racial and ethnic identification. Are you a young adult, or are you a more shall we say experienced adult? And what's your involvement in PKD? Do you have PKD? Do you care for someone with PKD? But most importantly, we give you a space, and I'll show you this at the end, to say, why would you be interested in this? I think it's a wonderful way for us to understand who you are, and quite frankly, for you to really begin to put together your thoughts of why you would be interested in joining us on this journey. So the discussion webinar will follow this. We're hoping to do it sometime in December, obviously before the holidays, so probably mid-December. We'll hold this to engage all of the participants from tonight who express an interest in patient engagement. It'll be an open discussion that here will expand to include our colleagues in the PKD RRC consortium from the other subcommittees that Reem briefly referred to. We'll talk about our progress to date and next steps. And then the patients and caregivers will be able to ask any questions and provide us with feedback. So this is basically a webinar to brainstorm with you, following this informational session, to brainstorm with you about the best engagement process. We don't a priori have a plan for exactly how this will happen, and by hook or by crook, this is the plan we're going to follow. This is an open discussion. So then for the group that comes forward and completes the survey, including the why do you want to do this, we'll go through the process of selection. Again, to do this in a meaningful way, we can't have a cast of thousands. Reem talked about for her Empower PKD, she had groups of 6 or 8. That's kind of what we're looking to start. But we'll start with that. This is the kind of thing where it's sort of like the whole concept of computers. Nothing can ever be erased from a computer. Let me assure you, you put yourself forward and identify yourself as an interested participant in this process. Even if you are not, for one reason or another, able to be in this first group, this inaugural group of the inpatient engagement group, we will not lose your contact information, and we will circle back. So in terms of the nomination and selection process, and again, I'm going to show you the REDCap survey after this presentation. It's a very brief, very easy survey. We've done this on what is very commonly used in medicine and biomedical research, the REDCap backbone. Basic demographics, as I mentioned, age, race, marital status. Why do we want marital status? We want marital status because we want to understand your perspective as someone who has the disease or someone who's caring for the disease. And if you're a single parent, that experience might be quite different, although the disease could be absolutely the same in the 2 children in the family, a family where there's great social support, a family where there is a single parent trying to manage everything. It's a different experience, and we want to understand this because we don't want to leave anyone out in our journey to move forward. We'll ask you what your experience is in research. And so we'll give you some examples. The idea here is to understand what you know about the research process, but perhaps just as importantly, what your experience has been. So if you say, oh, I had this most wonderful experience, that's great. Or if you say, I had a terrible experience, we want both voices because both voices will make us better. And in terms of the process, what I want to just make clear to you, and this is a wonderful visual slide that one of Reem's trainees put together. These are the sites that are involved in the PKD Research Consortium. So Reem is at the University, at Kansas University Medical Center. I'm part of a collaborative group that from the University of Alabama at Birmingham and Children's National Hospital, the University of Maryland Medical Center, and then there are other patient groups. And what we want to do is to have this patient engagement group both represent these centers, and I know there are numbers of people here on the webinar who are affiliated in terms of their care, the management of their clinical disease is at these different institutions. But we also want people from the greater PKD community. And then once we have this group assembled, we're going to take you through a boot camp. And you could say, well, now that sounds pretty austere and frightening, quite frankly. A boot camp is basically to help bootstrap you so you can be conversant. There will be likely a very heterogeneous group. Some will be very conversant in a very facile and easy way with the researchers that we'll interact with. Others will be like, I have a very limited understanding. What this boot camp is basically designed to do is to give every participant the confidence that they can express what they're thinking, that they're not shying away with, I don't really know very much about this, I shouldn't say anything. We're going to give you basically the empowerment to speak up because you're going to have enough knowledge about the various topics so that you can make sense of the sort of the grand scheme of things and add your voice. So this boot camp, as I said, familiarize the patients and the participants with first the concepts of patient engagement and the medical terminology related to their engagement. And then we're going to do this workshop and then sort of in the course of this workshop, reflect on previous patient engagement experiences. So it's an iterative process that will allow us to get to a more and more refined strategy. We'll talk about specific duties and tasks. And I think this was one of the many wonderful things for me about engaging with Reem in developing this program, is to be thinking about from her experience, how do you make this a really strong, vital, sustainable effort? And it's a process of moving forward, doing things, and then reflecting on what you've done. And so that will be really important, but doing this in the context of people having specific tasks. So we're not just going to sort of trundle along like the Peanuts cartoon as a sort of a scrum of kids. We're going to actually have tasks and each be responsible for contributing something, and obviously match people to tasks that they're comfortable doing. And then, as I mentioned, regular meetings, moving us forward, and reflection meetings, thinking about what have we done, where do we go, and as we go forward, how do we do it better? So in terms of the meetings, this is something that's important because we're asking you to engage, but we're asking you to commit to this engagement, to commit not only to the PKD RRC, but to commit to one another. So we'll talk about regular meetings. And the periodicity of these meetings and what these meetings will be about. Mostly they will be about issues that come up in the course of the various components of the PKD RRC. You know, where do we need patient input? And anything else actually that the patient engagement group says, you know, hold on, this is important. We need to discuss this. And then the reflection meetings. We're not going to do this every Tuesday, right? We're going to make some progress, stop, pause, take a breath, and reflect. What's been working well thus far? Where do things need improvement? At the beginning, to build trust, this is going to be a relatively closed discussion. But then we're going to broaden it out, and we're going to ask the whole consortium, how are we doing? So it's going to be basically going from a living room where we're talking to one another to, you know, the sort of the greater community to say, is this working? And I want to emphasize how important this process is by telling you that of all the NIH consortiums, including those that have patient engagement, there isn't one that has this sort of move forward, stop, reflect, then move forward again kind of process. And so the NIH is actually looking to us to see how can we develop a model that can be then used in other research consortia. So you're probably asking yourselves, well, okay, so I understand there are all these groups, and how do we fit? I mean, where's our home? And how are we going to interact with a group that's already established, investigators who already know one another? So Reem and I thought very carefully about that. And we're going to seat at the beginning the patient engagement group within our subgroup, the clinical resources and biomaterials subgroup. This will be the administrative home. This will be the sort of the initial community home. And as the group engages with the other subcommittees, cell models, the animal model, antibodies and vectors, and there are more that are coming, what will be important is that we may be able to position this group to where we'd really like it, which is in the center of the consortium, because we want this to be patient-focused, patient-centered research. We're not ready to do that right now. If we put you there, it'll be uncomfortable. So we want to give you a home where you get your sea legs, and then you can move to this position of primacy. So the patient roles, so it's not only important about what you're committing to, it's what are the roles. And this comes from Reem's experience, so I'm going to speak to it, but of course, Reem, please speak up. It's important for people to do this, again, not as a scrum, where everybody is kind of doing the same thing and moving in exactly the same direction. So the patient roles in this small group, there must be a facilitator. Again, Reem and I would be there for content advice, for content, to be a content resource. This is your voice. So the facilitator should come from your group. So this facilitator should lead and moderate meeting discussions. I can tell you I just ran a small international meeting that I invited parents of children with AD PKD and AR PKD. And one of the mothers, her professional job is organizational dynamics. She was a magnificent facilitator because, as she said, this is what I do professionally. Now, she needed a little help with the content, but she was great at leading and moderating discussions. So if this is your bag, if this is a sweet spot for you, this is a role for you. And I'm not going to read all the words here, but you can see them. The communicator, the persons who are the contact persons on the part of the patient engagement group. So they'll reach out if the group has any questions or thoughts or concerns, and kind of be, if you will, the interlocutor between this group and the bigger consortium. The coordinators, and there'll probably be more than one, delegating and following up on tasks within the patient engagement group. You're getting a sense. We're trying to develop a team that can take the field and move the ball forward. And Reem and I will be part managers in terms of helping you make some of the connections, at least initially, but in part cheerleaders. And then finally, there in this role, there is, and Reem has taught me this, there is an important role for the caretaker, and that is to ensure, while we're doing all this outreach to the consortium, to even other patient groups, et cetera, the dynamic within the group is partly going to follow the lead of the facilitator, but to be sure that the facilitator really understands what's going on for everybody, there is a role of the caretaker to ensure that internal communication, that internal cohesion of the group is strong and people are really feeling that they're being heard and the dynamic of the group is working. So our timeline, so just to take you all the way back over here to 2001, we spent a lot of time sort of seeing what's out there, what can we model? I mean, why create something out of whole cloth if there's a good model? Problem is, there isn't a good model. So here we are with the whole cloth. We reviewed the literature and all NIH consortia, and we came up with this structural or conceptual framework. We fast forward into 2022. We had hoped to do this a little earlier. COVID slows everything down. But today is our welcome webinar, and that will be followed shortly by a discussion webinar. The application process will happen over this time. And so by sort of the second, the sort of April, May, June period of 2023, we should have established our patient engagement group and conducted our first boot camp. And then we can begin the work of incorporating the patient engagement group into the consortium. We'll start with meetings about priorities, et cetera, as they relate to patient care and clinical trials, because that may be what the group is most familiar with. We'll introduce you to sort of the functional language of, what is the model group doing? What is the cell group doing? What is the antibody group doing? So that you have sort of some framework. And then we'll invite those colleagues to come and talk with you about what they are doing so that you can help us prioritize what resources we develop for the community. We'll have regular meetings and we'll have reflection meetings. And this will be an iterative process to make us better and better and better. And so if you're interested, what I would invite you to do is to, let me just pull this up.
Lisa, as you're pulling this up, there are two excellent questions that I would like that we answer live. So
Sure.
The first question asks that if the patients will be asked to advise on only human research resources or all resources. You touched on that in what you just discussed. And if the latter, which it is the latter, we're going to ask for input on everything.
Right.
Will we offer training to help patients understand what research in these for animal
Right.
models it looks like? The answer is absolutely yes. And guess
Right.
what we also believe is that by your engagement, we think our researchers are going to just become better at communicating what they're doing and how, so it will help all of us to be better communicators about what we're doing, what are the goals of our research. And yes, we do hope that you will be an active partner in these discussions with training. So that's going to come in the boot camp, but also a lot of these meetings moving forward. If there are needs, we will absolutely discuss them.
Right. So that's what I was getting at in terms of giving you the language and the concept so that you can understand the conversation with our colleagues. But this is a consortium that spans this broad range of reagents and resources that are being developed for the investigative community at large. And it's not just here in the United States. It's, it really is a global resource for investigators. And so, yes, absolutely, we would certainly do that. I think that let's see, Reem says she's going to answer. Can you provide some examples? I think following up on what we said would be the responsibilities. Reem, why don't I ask you if you could go ahead and give some examples of tasks,
Sure.
And then I can add to that.
Sure. So, it's kind of hard other than the roles, but the specific task is something we want to actually be informed by what the research community needs are from the patients, but also what the patients' priorities are in this dialogue. But I can give you a very simple example, not to say that this would be something, the first thing we tackle or anything, but when patients sign consent, for example, to participate in studies, well, now we have this research resource consortium that is making resources available for other researchers. It would be wonderful if the patients can inform us what kind of information should we provide in these consents. What would be helpful to discuss in these consents? Will actually patients be willing to do that or not? So just as an example for one of many. So, patients' blood and urine tests and cells and so on is our resources. And what should we actually, how to make this very transparent and explicit and true informed decision in these situations. Just as an example.
So, and I would add to that. So I think that's one of the things that we actually put forward to our consortium, as we were saying. So it's a great question, because we actually thought about that as well. What would be the first out of the box thing that you would tackle? And it is the issue of informed consent. For those of you who have been engaged in clinical studies, you know that they can often be multiple pages, and it can take an hour to go through. And it's really going through the language. It's not because of questions. It's just going through this ream of paper that can be so time consuming. So we want to get to be as efficient as possible and understand what's important to patients. By the same token, there are lots of studies that would like to collect everything every hour on the hour for weeks and weeks at a time, because things change. Well, that's not practical reality. So understanding what kinds of biologic samples do people feel is perfectly appropriate to request be collected. So urine and blood are obvious examples. But, for example, many of you have heard of the microbiome. Well, microbiome has lots of different sources. You can get the microbiome, a sense of the microbiome, from your nose. You can get it from your stool. Would you be willing to have nasal swabs as part of a clinical study? Would you be willing to give a stool sample? That gets into areas that people don't necessarily associate. I think another example of just right out of the box, and this is from me as a pediatrician, one of the questions that I get asked is, how many blood draws will be required? And you could say, well, that's really a pediatric issue, but I dare say there are numbers of adults that having multiple blood draws in a short period of time is a very anxiety-provoking kind of experience. And so what kinds of parameters would make sense? These are the kinds of questions that need to be considered as we're designing a trial. And until very recently, we never asked. We just focused on what we thought we needed. And now is the time to ask. There's a question about initiate an application or you'll notify us. What I'm going to do is I want to just show you the survey, and then we'll go back and we'll show you how to get access to it. There's a question about how much time do you estimate per week or per month? I think that's not absolutely knowable. And that's the kind of thing that if we gave you an answer now, you would say, wait a minute, you told us this was a dialogue. We want to come together to an idea of how often we should meet and how much time each meeting should involve, because people have lives. I mean, Reem and I had many conversations about what was the best time to do this webinar, right? People who have young families, this is dinner time on the East Coast and the Central Time Zone. Saturdays is family time. So trying to get a sense of things, it would be the consensus of this group. And we may have a follow-on patient engagement group that would pick a different time and a different set of periodicity. And that's fine, because that is all predicated on who are the active members at the moment. And so URL, we're getting to that. So I just want to show you so that people are not nervous about, oh my God, I'm going to have to spend hours doing a college application. Email address. We purposely chose this because many of you will send Gmail addresses and we can't trace you. So it is a relatively easy way for you to remain anonymous, but we have a way to reach out to you. So if you fill this out, we start with this email address. Dear J, Red Sox fan @gmail.com. Thank you for your interest. We would like to set up a discussion with you about X, Y, or Z. Now, Jay, Red Sox fan, may live in Oakland, California. We have no idea, right? The only way we might have a sense that you don't live in the Boston area is because we ask what state you live in. And part of that is we're looking for a diverse group. That's why we ask you about age, why we ask you about sex. Remember, that's a biologic construct. Your gender identification could be anything. It doesn't matter. But we want to have a sense that we don't have a group of homogeneous folks that are coming to this. We want to have diverse representation. Same thing about areas of the country, same thing about levels of education. And here, again, it's not, we're not getting into the nitty gritty of, how many years of college did you have? Do you have 6 PhDs? Did you not graduate from high school? It's broad categories. Current marital status, I mentioned the rationale for that. Employment status, this again is to be respectful of people and their time. Current income, in the United States, at least, your experience with clinical trials certainly is impacted by current household income. It is one set of challenges to be in this lower range, less than $40,000 a year, and to think about participating in a clinical trial than it is to be a really affluent person. And we want to understand, if we want to have trials that are truly diverse, what kinds of things do we need to think about? Things like transportation might be really important. Family history of PKD. Again, just trying to understand, because we're focused on AD PKD, what kind of stakeholder you are, et cetera, et cetera. And here's the money part. We don't want, you to write War and Peace here. This doesn't need to be a dissertation, just 250 or so words about why you want to do this. We want to get a window into who you are in terms of your level of interest. And that, again, will help us in forming this group. So let me get out of this and go back to the slide set.
And Lisa, as you're doing that, there are a couple of questions that I think would be good to answer. So one question is, Linda's asking, she's been involved with Mayo Clinic research. She's also involved in the PKD Foundation. And how is this consortium affiliated? Or is it affiliated? And is there essentially communication with that? And I would say that we're very closely coordinated with the PKD Foundation. Some of the members of the PKD Foundation are on this call. They've helped us disseminate information about this. But I also want to say that the research resources that the consortium is working on are available to any and every researcher out there. So that, our colleagues at Mayo Clinic are part of the group that's definitely going to benefit from all this work. So yes, we're closely collaborating and very hopefully effectively communicating with all really physicians and researchers who are treating patients with PKD.
Okay, I think that there's another piece to that. And that is, this isn't a closed group. This is a really open space. And we're trying to be sure we have as much communication with our group, but with other groups as well. It would be nuts for the things that we said for us to not be working with the PKD Foundation, because we have the same goals. It would be nuts for us to not take phone calls from other consortia and say, hey, we're doing things this way. How are you doing things? Can we share best practices? That will be something for our group to decide going forward. At what point do we think we have something to share as best practices? And there's a thing in the chat about income. Shouldn't that be confidential? In fact, the REDCap survey is essentially anonymized because we have no way of identifying you as a person. It is a sort of a statistic for the group, so that we get the representation of people across a socioeconomic spectrum, across a racial and ethnic spectrum, across a male-female spectrum, across an age spectrum. That's really what we're looking for, and we're trying to be as respectful as possible with the way that we handle these data. The folks have asked if there's a URL. So two things. Annie, could you put into the chat the link to the survey that I just showed? And then for those of you who have QR readers on your phones, this would be another way instead of this link to get to the REDCap survey that I just showed. We do tweet. I'm not sure we're going to pay the $8 a month or whatever it is now to continue to be able to tweet, but at this point we do tweet. This is the website for the PKD RRC.org consortium, and we'll post these slides there. And then this is the email address for the consortium. And if folks are interested, I would certainly be happy to share my email in the chat, and I'll bet you Reem would be as well.
100%. I think there are a couple more questions in the chat. Taslim is asking, are you going to tell or discuss what is existing? What is the existing literature, and what is absolutely necessary to find cure of PKD? That's a great question. All the questions, by the way, have been really wonderful. The answer to that is this is really a big part of the discussion that happened in the PKD RRC, where you will hear researchers discussing, I think we should approach this. No, I don't think this is the priority, and so on. But you bring up a very good point. If after discussion with the patients, we find out that the patient, one of the priorities is actually simply to a map of the existing evidence and evidence gap. We need to know what your needs are so we can answer to them. And that speaks to a very dear area to my heart. A lot of what I do is evidence synthesis, is really looking at the literature and assessing how certain are we about certain answers and so on. So while this is, as Lisa discussed before, we don't have a set agenda where things we want to check off the list, but you will help us set that agenda. There's also another question. I don't know if you want to take that, Lisa, from Chris.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting point, Chris, and I will tell you, we really discussed how to get a sense of who might be the people coming forward. And we opted for this brief kind of description for a couple of reasons. Number one, we really are genuinely interested in why would someone in a busy life, who in addition to a busy life is dealing with a chronic disease, either in themselves or in their family, why would they be interested in participating in this effort? So that interest was part of it. The second thing that was important is that at least the first pass, because remember, I made the point that, it's a little bit stunning in 2022, but there isn't a model for us to work from. Reem is in Kansas, I'm in Washington, so we have to do all of this sort of by Zoom and electronically. And I recognize that at this first cut, this first pass, that this approach could leave out people who have literacy issues, for example, people who have language issues, English not being their first language, or a language they're comfortable in communicating with. We absolutely understand that. I think at the end of the day, and we had very thoughtful discussions about how can we be as inclusive as possible, we came up with three things. First, this is the first pass in our initiative. We're going to do this iteratively, and we're going to figure out how we can improve our inclusivity as we go through this. Second, we needed to sort of figure out, we can't eat the whole apple in one felt swoop. So we need to take the first bite of the apple. And the first bite of the apple seemed most feasible if we focus on folks who could communicate in this forum and are comfortable communicating by electronic fora and with English as their language of communication. Moving down the road, wouldn't it be great if we could expand this to native tongues of other people and include them? But for the first pass, we thought that would be an issue. And in terms of literacy, I must tell you, as a pediatrician, I run into that not infrequently, where parents are very capable, et cetera, but have real literacy issues. And that is not something to be dismissed. It is something that requires another dimension of consideration in terms of including them, because we can't just then send them something to read. We can't ask them to write something. We can't give them background material. And so those kinds of concerns are there for us as we're thinking down the road. But again, this is a first pass. And so people who are able to join this Zoom call tonight, to participate, to fill out this initial PKD resume, meet that first level criteria for how we think we could reasonably move this group forward. I hope that answers your question, Chris. It's a very thoughtful question.
Lisa, there were a couple requests to send the survey link by email to the people who registered for this webinar, and I think that's quite reasonable, so we'll do that. And I'm gonna look here to Annie's help to make sure we do that. Another question was about, is the patient engagement group open to only people in the US or abroad? I'm just gonna say we are gonna be very inclusive. This is an NIH funded initiative, so we will be limiting it to people within the US. That doesn't mean that through other collaboration Lisa and I are working on, we will not engage with patients when we already actually do engage with patients outside the US, but this specific initiative is going to be limited. Right. To
and part of that, you know, I mean, so our Canadian friends would point out, but Canadian investigators can get NIH grants. And in fact, in certain kinds of funding mechanisms, people in Australia and Europe and other places in the world can get NIH grants. We're very aware of that. Again, feasibility. If you're in Canada, you fall broadly into the same time zones as people in the United States. Of course, we can include you. It's a feasibility question. If you're in Australia, if you're in, you know, Sydney, Australia, and you're 14 hours ahead in the timeline, again, we're taking the first bite of the apple. Maybe in the first, maybe not even in the second pass, could we include our Australian colleagues. But down the road, we should be thinking about if there's a groundswell of support for people in Australia to contribute and to be part of this, thinking about developing with our colleagues in Australia a companion group, or thinking about other ways that we could do this. So we're starting, and we're open to all these wonderful suggestions, and we will dutifully put them in our figurative file, so that as we're thinking about, okay, we accomplished this, we're moving forward, what else do we need to consider? What do we now have the bandwidth to consider?
And Lisa, one more question. Are we connected to research and indirect PKD solutions, such as new type of transplant, 3D organ printing, and all that?
Right. So great questions. And that is actually the field of kidney disease writ broadly. Our particular consortium is not thinking about 3D organ printing, although we are considering as part of the models, and this would fit probably, interestingly enough, more likely in the cell model group. We're thinking about organoids. We're thinking about those sort of 3D platforms that are more amenable to high throughput screening strategies than animal models, but have more complexity than a cellular model. So that is being developed. And again, wouldn't it be great to have patient caregiver input into how we prioritize that effort? Xenotransplantation, donor stem cell trainer, donor stem cell kinds of initiatives, that really is beyond the purview of PKD research as it's currently formulated, and our mandate from the NIH is to support PKD research.
Well, all good things come to an end, unfortunately. This really has been truly wonderful. I can't tell you how excited Lisa and I are about your interest and the potential for all kinds of exciting things that we will do together and learn from each other. And actually, as she said, this will hopefully set as a role model for other groups who are trying to, tackle how could patient inform a research resource consortium that is really a majority of it is focused on basic research. But we thank you very much for being with us today. And don't hesitate to reach out if there is any other questions that we can answer.